Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. It's been a few days since you've heard my lovely voice teaching to you through this screen. So maybe you've missed me, maybe you haven't. Either way, we are starting a new unit. This is Unit 3, Fraction Operations. The first lesson is comparing and ordering fractions. By the end of today, you should be able to compare and order fractions. And some of you probably already know what you're doing because you have been working on this skill for the last probably 2 or more years. You did a lot of work last year in 6th grade with fractions. And so the only thing that's different for this year is that now we have negative fractions. And so that requires a little bit or a lot more thinking. But some of the ways that you've learned how to compare, order, add, subtract, multiply, and divide fractions in the past are going to come back again. And so I hope that has you feeling good and comfortable and ready to move on. I'm going to give you a minute to open up this to this page and fill out the date in the upper right hand corner. Today's date is November 14th, 2017. And as always, my expectation is that you are taking the notes, you are listening to this entire video. I'm going to ask you to do some things throughout the notes just to make sure you're on the right track. But if you have questions along the way, or if you have questions when you're finished, please feel free to raise your hand and Miss Wolf and I will come around to answer your questions. I'm not going to lie, you guys, I am on take 3 of this video. It is late and I am tired. I had to take a quick ice cream break because I needed a little bit more energy. So, even teachers struggle sometimes to do our job because I would rather be sleeping or watching Netflix, but you know what? That's not my job. My job is to be responsible and to provide you guys with as much as I can to help support you in your learning. And so I'm going to do my job and I'm going to try to do it the best that I can. And that means I'm going to do it for the 3rd time because I wasn't happy with this first or the 2nd time. So I've got some mint chocolate chip ice cream running through my veins. I feel like I'm good to go. Now I have you all thinking about mint chocolate chip ice cream and you're probably not focusing. So back on track, here we go. There are several strategies that you can use to compare and order fractions. I'm going to go through each one of them and you get to decide. The great thing about being a mathematician is that you get to decide which one works best for you. And one might work better than others depending on the situation, or you might just stick with the same strategy every single time you have to do this. It might not be the same as your neighbor, and that's okay as long as you are able to use evidence to support your thinking. That is all that you need to be able to do. So here we go. We've got nothing in the toolbox for today, but there is some vocabulary, and I want you to do what I have done, and that is circle the word numerator, which tells the number of parts or pieces, and then double underline the word denominator. The denominator tells the size of the parts or pieces. I also want you to write over here these words: part on top, divided by, which that is what this fraction bar is, and then whole on the bottom. Because when we think about fractions, we're thinking about what part out of the entire whole are we looking at. I usually default to pizza when we talk about fractions because I'm a fan of pizza and I think it's just really easy to visualize and to think about. I also like to use another real world situation like the score you've earned on a test, because I feel like by now you guys are really familiar with and comfortable with thinking about how did you do on the test? Okay, well, how many points was it out of? How many points did I earn? And then you can kind of gauge how well you did, how high you scored, or how low you scored based on that fraction. And so you'll hear me use those 2 examples quite a bit. Strategy number 1, using a common denominator. This is probably the most commonly used strategy. You hopefully are pretty familiar with this. When you have 2 or more fractions, or when 2 or more fractions have the same denominator, called a common denominator, the larger numerator, whatever number is on top that's the biggest, is the larger fraction. This is true because the parts or pieces are the same size, so the number of parts or pieces will determine the order. For example, find the biggest fraction, thinking about a pizza, If someone ate 2 out of the 3 slices of pizza versus 1 out of the 3 slices of pizza versus 3 out of the 3 slices of pizza, well, this person ate the most because they ate the whole pizza. Thinking about the smallest fraction, if every single pizza was made up of 9 slices and one person ate 1 slice, another person ate 7 slices, and the third person ate 2 slices, the smallest fraction would be the smallest amount of pizza that was eaten, and that would have just been 1 out of those 9 slices because there was a lot of the pizza that was left over. Strategy number 2, common numerator. Oh, wait, I'm going to go back here for a second. Will you find some space, please, to write your favorite kind of pizza? Maybe right here at the top where it says examples. Will you please write your favorite kind of pizza, what kind and from where? So if I was doing this, I would write down cheese and green pepper from Domino's. I really love cheese and green pepper, and I really love Domino's. I also like Papa Murphy's Veggie Delight. But up here, I would write cheese and green pepper from just about anywhere, really. But I do love Domino's. Will you do that and then move on? Thank you. Strategy number 2, common numerators. When 2 or more fractions have the same numerator, called a common numerator, the smaller denominator is actually the larger fraction. Because the number of parts or pieces is the same, the size of the parts or pieces determines the order. So if we're looking at this first example, going back to pizza, 9 out of 10 slices, 9 out of 14 slices, or 9 out of 9 slices, the smallest fraction would be 9/14 because that was the least amount of pizza that was eaten. 9 out of 9 is the greatest because this was an entire pizza that was eaten. 9 out of 10 is still pretty big, but there's 1 slice left, and so it's not quite as big as 9 out of 9. The biggest fraction in this set of examples, I'm going to think about a test. So if you got a 7 out of 9 on your test, a 7 out of 8 on your test, or a 7 out of 10 on your test, which percentage would be the highest? Well, that's 7 out of 8 because you got almost 100%. You only got 1 wrong. And so this would be the biggest fraction because it has the highest percent. Strategy number 3, missing parts or pieces. Sometimes it is easier to compare the missing parts than the original fractions. This is true when comparing fractions like 6/7 and 7/8. In the first fraction, 6/7, there is 1/7 missing, so you can kind of visualize that slice that's gone. In the second fraction, there's 1/8 missing from the whole. 1/8 is smaller than 1/7 because it's divided into more pieces. So if you have a slice left over out of 8 slices, that part is actually smaller than having 1 slice left over that's a pizza made out of 7 slices. Since 7/8 is missing a smaller part, it is the smaller fraction. Wait a minute. Is that right? 7/8 is missing a smaller part of the whole. It is the smaller fraction. No, that's not true. It should be the larger fraction. Oh boy. That should be the larger fraction because there's a smaller part missing. So let's look at these examples to make sure I'm on the right track here. Find the biggest fraction, 6 out of 7, 8 out of 9, or 2 out of 3. Well, thirds has the biggest slices, right? So if you have 2 out of the 3 slices still there, that means 1/3 was taken away or eaten. And that's a pretty big chunk that was taken away. If you eat 1/3 of a pizza, that's kind of a big slice. Let's think about 8 out of 9. If you have a pizza cut into 9 slices and you ate 8 out of the 9 slices, there's just a little tiny slice left of 1/9. If you have a pizza made out of 7 slices and you ate 6 of them, a seventh, there's 1/7 left out of the pizza. And so if I think about 1/7 versus 1/9 versus 1/3, the biggest fraction would be 8/9 because there's just a really small sliver of that pizza missing. Find the smallest fraction. Sorry about that mess up right there. Find the smallest fraction. 6/7, 5/6, and 11/12. 11/12. If you eat 11 out of 12 pieces, there's just 1/12 missing. That's almost one whole. So that's a pretty big fraction. 5/6, there's 1/6 of the fraction missing. And here there's 1/7. This is the smaller missing piece, which means that 5/6 is actually the smaller fraction. This is not my favorite one, if you can't tell. I don't use this strategy a lot. It doesn't mean that you can't. It just means that for me, there are other strategies that make more sense. So I stick with those. Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry. Moving on. Benchmarks. Benchmarks are fractions that are easy to recognize. 1/2 is a good example. If you're comparing two fractions and one is greater than 1/2 and the other is less than 1/2, it's easy to determine which fraction is the larger. So 2/6, 4/9, and 4/7, we can kind of think of those compared to 1/2. 2/6 is less than 1/2 because 3/6 would make 50% or 1/2. 4/9 is also less than 1/2 because 4/8 would be exactly 1/2, but this is 4/9, which is a little bit less. And 4/7 is more than 1/2 because half of 7 is 3.5, and 4 would be more than that. So the biggest fraction is the one that's greater than 1/2. These two are really close, but this one's larger than 1/2, so I know that it's bigger. The smallest fraction, okay, thinking about 4/8, that's half the pizza. 5/9, that's actually more than half. 5 out of 10, so 5 out of 9 would be more than half. And 7 out of 15, well, I know that 7 is exactly half of 14. So 7 out of 15 is smaller than 1/2, less than 1/2. So this is exactly 1/2, bigger than 1/2, smaller than 1/2, therefore it's the smaller fraction. All right, 2 more to go. Converting fractions to decimals. This might be one of my favorites just because I do it a lot and I like to think about money because I think money is easier to compare than fractions. And so converting a fraction to decimals is one strategy that you could use. Fractions can be converted to equivalent decimals. Once the conversion is complete, the equivalent decimals can be used to compare the original fractions. So you just did division and got decimals. So I know that you've practiced this. You can also use a calculator to help you convert fractions into decimals. And so 3/4 or 4/5, this little circle is just wanting us to put a symbol for which is greater or which is smaller. And if you compare 3/4 to 4/5, I'm going to bounce back here to show you how you might do that using division. So 3/4, kick the dog out of the house. 3 goes on the inside, 4 goes on the outside. 4 does not go into 3. Boop. So I had a 0, I had a decimal point. 4 goes into 30, exactly, not exactly, 7 times. 7 times 4 is 28. Oh, shucks, sorry. Subtract, and you get 2. 4 does not go into 2, so we get 1 0 for free. 4 goes into 20 exactly 5 times. So 3/4 converts to 0.75. I can think about that like 75 cents. The other fraction that we were comparing was 4/5. 4/5 is the same as 4 divided by 5. 5 does not go into 4, so we add a 0 and a decimal point. 5 goes into 40 exactly 8 times. 8 times 5 is 40. So we could add a 0. 0.8 is the same as 80 cents. And now for me, that's really easy to compare. I know that 80 cents is more than 75 cents, which means 4/5 must be the larger fraction. This last example, this last strategy is actually a newer one, and you maybe haven't seen it before, but it's drawing a picture. And I think this is particularly helpful when we're talking about negative fractions, because you have to remember that sometimes, not sometimes, all the time, the negative numbers seem like they're bigger because they look bigger when you look at them, but the bigger the negative number is, the smaller the value is. And so I like this little drawing. I'm going to get it up on my handy dandy whiteboard here to compare these fractions. So -2/3, -4/5, -1/2, -1/4, and -2/5. And you guys might already be thinking about one of those other strategies to help you figure this out, but I want to show you one more way to look at it. If you think about this like a number line, but written up and down instead of left to right, -2/3. Okay, here's 0, here's -1. -2/3 is not quite -1, but I can think about this because from 0 to -1, that's a whole, right? If I divide this into thirds and I shade in 2 out of those 3/3, and the reason I'm going down is because I'm getting more negative, and so here's where -2/3, excuse me, would land me. The next number, -4/5, if I think about this as one whole again, and I divide it into fifths, oh, that was pretty lucky. 4 out of those 5 would be shaded. Which means I'm going lower or farther negative. The more negative it is, the smaller its value. So I can compare those two pretty easily. If I keep going, -1/2. Here's one whole. I cut it in half. Ooh, that wasn't very good. I cut it in half. I shade 1 out of the 2 sections. Again, it's negative because it's going farther away from 0 toward -1. And I can tell pretty easily that so far that is closest to 0, which means it's actually the greatest so far. Whatever's farthest from 0, going toward -1, is the smallest fraction. -1/4, I'm going to cut it in half and then cut it in halves again to make fourths. One of those is shaded. Ooh, that's really close to 0, which means it's so far my greatest fraction. And then -2/5. That's -1. Again, I'm going to use this one over here because I had fifths already. Two-fifths are shaded, and that's -2/5. So it's pretty easy for me to see if I'm ordering these from least to greatest. Least means farthest to the left or farthest away from 0 going to the left, going towards -1. So this would be my least greatest. Next, this one's awfully close. Next, next. And then my greatest fraction is the one closest to 0, which in this case is negative 1/2. Again, you might already converted all of those to decimals and then compared them that way, and that's great if you did that. What's even better is if you already have these fractions memorized, what their conversions are, because that makes your life a lot easier. But we'll get there. All right, you guys, you can go ahead right now and pause the video, choose a strategy to answer each question. I want you to choose or find the biggest or smallest fraction based on whatever strategy you choose. And the way I want you to show me which is I want you to put an X through it. Whichever is the biggest or smallest, depending on the directions, put an X through that, and that way I will see that you are doing your job. Pause the video, come back when you're done, and I'll finish up. All right, I would like you to write a summary at the bottom of your notes, and I want you to use this sentence starter. I prefer using this strategy, and you're going to tell me which one that is, to compare fractions because, and you're going to tell me why. So it doesn't matter which one you choose, I just want to know your thinking, and I want to know that you've listened to this video all the way to the end. So I prefer using which strategy. Go back in your notes if you need to. And tell me why. Use complete sentences, capital letter, correct punctuation. This should take you 5 minutes or less, and then you get to get started on your homework. Before you do that though, I want to show you that there are some resources available to you. So this is my website, and if you look, there is a link to Unit 3 videos. On that link are a few videos that I've added, as well as some games. These are 3 videos that if you're not sure how to simplify or convert, you can watch those. They're short and they do a really good job of just reminding you about how to do those skills. And then if you want a little bit more help with comparing fractions, or maybe just another way to think about it, you can watch that comparing fractions video. I think it's like 5 minutes or something. If you don't need those, then you can just get started on your homework. Here's the deal. When you get going way too fast, or when you just start to guess, that's when you start to get them wrong. So I will be looking for your evidence, or for you to be able to back up your thinking. So instead of just writing a symbol, you need to be able to show me or tell me what you did to think about that problem in order to get it right. So if this is not enough space for you to do that thinking because you want to draw a picture or because you want to convert to decimals, then you should be using either a whiteboard or attaching a separate sheet of paper. I'm actually going to go back and ask you which method or strategy you used to get these answers, because I don't just want you guessing. Take your time, do the best you can. You may listen to music while you work. You may not move around until you have checked in with me or Miss Wolf. So stay where you're at, get settled, take a quick brain break, stretch break if you need to. I know this has been kind of a long video, but there's lots of strategies that I needed to review in order for you to be successful. So thanks for bearing with me. Again, if you have questions, raise your hand. Otherwise, get to work.